So as the public sphere has expanded over time and has become institutionalized, that expansion has become institutionalized over time, and as the size of the national government has grown and has come to take on more and more responsibility for solving problems that are increasingly difficult for individuals to solve, the so as the institution of governance, of government, as the institution of the public sphere has evolved, grown, taken on more power and responsibility, it has changed, it has had an influence on the motivations for participation, um, really in two fundamental ways. Um, First of all, it's it's made it more difficult for individuals and individual communities to to try to solve a problem. Um, it you know it this is in part because the problems aren't individual. They're not local anymore. They're not local, right? So think about a local problem. Let's say homelessness, right? It's likely the case that homelessness is caused by um, issues that are not local in nature, right? So the big manufacturing plant, or let's say Newport News shipbuilding in Newport News lays off 1,000 people. You have 20,000 people that work there. Let's say they lay off 1,000 people, 10% of their workforce, right? Um, 20% of the workforce. Um, whatever it is, 1,000, 2,000 people. They're doing that because their business is susceptible to market forces that are global, right? Yet there may end up being a couple hundred people homeless because of that. Locals are trying to basically take care of the homelessness problem caused by that layoff, but it isn't a problem they can solve by getting Newport News Shipbuilding to hire them back, or increasing the business that they give to Newport News Shipbuilding, because Newport News Shipbuilding is here building ships, but it really isn't, its business isn't driven by anything local. And so it's difficult for locals and communities to solve problems because the problems aren't local and individual anymore. And then also the motivation for participation has changed, in part because we've become used to government solving problems. It's we you know it this didn't happen in our generation. It isn't something that evolved here while I've been alive. I grew up with the idea that government was there solving problems. You guys grew up with the idea that government is there solving problems. My parents grew up that way. Our grandparents grew up that way. I mean, we can go back as far back as the Depression era generation before we would run into a generation prior to the Depression where they didn't grow up with the idea that government would solve problems, or at least be involved in trying to solve the problems. And so in some ways, the institution has evolved to take on problems that we can't solve on our own in a local way, but the institution has also been doing it for so long that we've become used to it. Um, and the argument that I'm making here isn't a you know a, a critique of big government. It isn't it isn't an argument of that like a Republican or Tea Party person might critique big government. That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is that the reality is the problems that we're dealing with are too big for us to solve individually and at a local level. And so those problems have been too big for a while, for 100 years, ever since our economy has become more dependent on the world's economy, ever since our nation has become more connected to the world. And so we're in this boat now where our our the size of government is what it is. It's really difficult to shrink. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, what he wanted to do was shrink the size of government. Um, at he had a big mandate to do that, and he couldn't. Government actually grew under Ronald Reagan. Government grew under the presidency of George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president. Government grew under Bill Clinton. Um, Government grew under George W. Bush. Government has shrunk a little bit under Barack Obama, but that's in part because of the Great Recession, right? Um, whether a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, the size of government continues to grow. And it's in part because the problems are still there, and the problems are still too big for us to handle at a local level. Whether it doesn't matter whether a Republican is in office or a Democrat's in office, the problems are the same. And so, as an institution, the public sphere has grown and expanded, and it's the nature of that growth and expansion has altered the motivation for participation. So, my motivation for problem solving, for civic duty problem solving, is not encouraged by big government. It's discouraged by big government, um, and so and so it is what it is. I can't change that. The institution is what it is. When I come back, I'm gonna tie all these three big institutions together and try to wrap this up with a summary.